One of the pillars of the Commander format, and one of its most controversial discussion topics, is threat assessment. In a situation where you have limited responses to make and 3 opponents playing threats, it's only natural that you're going to have to let a few go by and wait for the right targets. The end result is plenty of powerful cards that should probably be responded to, but generally get left alone for one reason or another. In today's top 10, we'll be taking a look at some of the cards that tend to go unanswered, despite how strong they actually are. Before we get into the list, I want to clarify that there's usually a pretty clear reason why these cards go untouched. In fact, some of these cards just plain and simple can't be answered cleanly. These are just cards that tend to have a large impact on the game and can be problematic when left in play, but usually are anyway. I also want to clarify that we'll specifically be discussing casual to highly tuned EDH. Some of these entries can be competitive cards that will get answered more frequently when playing at a higher power level. Lastly, if you tend to answer these cards and don't think they belong on this list, that is totally fine. Obviously, every Commander playgroup is going to be different, but generally speaking, these are cards that tend to avoid the collective crosshairs for a range of different reasons. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Starting us off at number 10 is Survival of the Fittest. For 1 and a green, you get an enchantment with an activated ability that costs 1 green mana. By discarding a creature card, you can add another creature from your deck to your hand. Alright, now before you click off the video, let me clarify this. If you have a counterspell when this card is getting cast, it is definitely going to be drawing some attention. The problem is that if this card resolves, it's highly unlikely that it's going to be removed. In high power settings, this card is probably going to get combo pieces and the game isn't going to last another turn anyway, but it's also perfectly viable as a toolbox card that can tutor out helpful creatures to suit specific scenarios. The reason this card often goes unanswered is going to be a common theme in this video. If survival is in play and you attempt to target it with removal, the player can simply activate the ability in response and still get their value. With that being said, and especially in the case of Survival of the Fittest, it can still be beneficial to hit the card anyway. The best time to interact with Survival is after the player has used the effect. They still have their search on the stack, but forcing them to discard more before they have the chance to add the creature to their hand, opening the possibility of discarding the creature that they grabbed, can potentially put them in a situation where they have to discard a creature they can't afford to lose if they want additional value. While it may still not be a favorable interaction for sure, Survival is definitely not a card that you should ever leave in play for more than a turn. More activations is not something you want to have happen, but it is understandable why people would rather not throw out removal, knowing that the player controlling the enchantment is going to get some value out of it anyway. Still, the fact that this card is such an obvious target and likely to draw counterspells keeps it from holding a higher spot on the list. The number 9 spot goes to Future Sight. For 2 and 3 blue, you get an enchantment with 2 static effects. Play with the top card of your deck revealed, and you can play the top card of your deck at any time. While Future Sight itself is a bit outdated, since its release we've seen a plethora of other cards with similar effects. Cards like Elsha the Infinite, Oracle of Moldiah, Bolas' Citadel, and Vizier of the Menagerie all grant you repeatable access to the top card of your deck in varying capacities. Now, some of these cards, like Bolas' Citadel and Elsha, tend to be considered combo pieces, and as such, do tend to attract ire from the table. But many of the more innocuous ones, like Oracle, Vizier, or even Future Sight itself, tend to fly under the radar, and to be honest, they probably shouldn't. While these cards may not read like they do much on the surface, if left unchecked, they can provide a pretty obscene amount of advantage to the player controlling them, especially if the player has access to top deck manipulation. Fetch lands in particular can be powerful alongside these cards, letting you shuffle away a card if you don't need it and providing another opportunity for a useful card to wind up on top. Future Sight effects can get out of hand, and occasionally manage to do so without raising too many alarms. Incremental advantage engines are a hallmark of the Commander format, and these are possibly some of the most underappreciated and, as a result, unanswered value engines in the format. Give them a try if you haven't already. The number 8 spot goes to Sensei's Divining Top. For 1 generic mana, you have an artifact with 2 abilities. The first lets you pay 1 mana to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and rearrange them however you want. The second lets you tap top in order to draw a card and place top on top of your deck. Top is one of the most notorious Magic cards ever printed, terrorizing the Legacy format for many years thanks to its powerful interactions with cards like Counterbalance, which can effectively lock an opponent out of casting various spells. In Commander, Top is a lot less oppressive, but it is still a powerful card in its own right. The ability to keep rearranging your top 3 cards each turn, helping prevent dead draws, can create a much smoother play pattern from one turn to the next. Couple this with the ability to draw desired responses at crucial moments, and Top puts in a lot of work over the course of a game. So why doesn't Top draw removal? Well, it's simply a slippery card. You basically have to wait for your opponent to go and draw a card in order to interact with it at all. Otherwise, they're just going to draw a card in response, and Top jumps safely to the top of the deck. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, in Commander you have to gauge your threat priorities very carefully, and generally speaking, the value that Top provides just isn't enough to warrant going through the hoops required to get rid of it. Ironically though, pairing Top with the future side effects in our previous spot could be a whole different story, greatly increasing the value of both cards. Even without them, a Top left unchecked can be a bit of a headache and has potential to be one of the highest value 1-drops in the format. Up next at number 7, we have Ishai, Ojutai Dragon Speaker. For 2, a white and a blue, Ishai is a 1/1 legendary bird monk with flying. Anytime an opponent casts a spell, Ishai gets a +1/+1 counter, and has Partner, which lets you have a second commander as long as both have the Partner ability. Ishai is one of many cards that share a similar effect to get larger and larger as more spells are cast. Initially, these threats are generally pretty small, but in a game containing 4 players have a tendency to grow out of hand incredibly fast. I honestly think that these cards often get left in play much longer than they should, simply because they're so meek when they first come in and don't always present like an actual concern. You tell yourself that you have time to handle it, then the next thing you know, a 20/20 creature is about to smack you in the face. Granted, many of these cards lack any form of meaningful evasion, so cards like Taurian Mauler and Forgotten Ancient can often just be chump blocked. But cards like Managorger Hydra, Sunscorch Regent, or even Ishai? Yeah, those are going to be a bit more challenging. Now obviously if you're holding up a removal spell, you can always try to out it once it, becomes an actual threat, but especially in the case of Ishai, when you're guaranteed to have access to blue, leaving it in play too long could give the player a chance to pull proper protection. This doesn't even mention the fact that by the time you're ready to deal with the growing creature, other problems may have already come down that could demand more immediate action. These style of cards are actually some of my personal favorite, giving you the chance to drop a cheap creature and let it grow while you continue to make other plays. And the fact that Ishai can sit in your command zone, where you not only have constant access to it, but can also bring it back once it gets removed, makes it a constant problem for the table. The number 6 spot goes to Necropotence. Necropotence? Necropotence. I don't know, one of those probably. But for 3 black mana, you get an enchantment with 3 effects. The first ensures you always skip your draw phase, the second exiles any card you discard from your graveyard, and the third is what makes the first 2 drawbacks completely irrelevant. By paying 1 life, you can exile the top card of your deck face down, and add that card to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Necropotence, as I will be pronouncing it for the rest of this section, is widely considered one of the most broken cards in EDH. Having a starting life total of 40 gives the player dropping this card instant access to an absolutely mind-breaking amount of card advantage, and just like Survival of the Fittest, can access that advantage at instant speed. If Necropotence isn't countered specifically, the player controlling it will gain a ton of cards into their hand at the end of the turn. Unlike Survival, there isn't really a clean way to interact with Necropotence ever. So the question becomes, is it worth it to remove a resolved Necropotence? Honestly, it's hard to say. There's a good chance that your opponent responds by simply drawing a bunch more cards, but they don't get access to them until the end of the turn, and they do lose life for each card. But if you leave it in play, they don't draw on the next turn, and they have to exile cards if they decide to pick up more than their specified hand limit. So maybe there's a reason to leave it in play? There are really 2 schools of thought on Necropotence. You either out it immediately and force your opponent to choose an immediate and set number of cards that they want to pick up, or you leave it in play and let your opponent get recurring value each turn. Like I said in the beginning, the fact that Necropotence isn't usually outed isn't surprising, but it's still very much a card that should be outed if possible. I don't know, maybe it's time to start playing Krosan Grip if you know your playgroup is bringing these to the table. As we enter into the top 5, we have Soul Ring. For 1 mana, you have an artifact that makes 2 mana. It's simple, it's powerful, and it's too good for pretty much every other format. Sharing this spot is Mana Crypt, a similar and honestly stronger card with a similar effect, but Soul Ring is taking the seat simply because it's literally in every Commander product, and Mana Crypt is currently sitting at $170. Soul Ring has long been a bit of a controversial card in Commander. On one hand, you have people who say that because it's so easily accessible and everyone can use it, it balances itself to a certain extent and so should be legal in the format. On the other hand, if one person opens Soul Ring and the other 3 don't, that player is now untapping on turn 2 with 4 mana. Being 2 turns ahead of everyone else, needless to say, is kind of strong. But at the end of the day, Soul Ring is literally just a mana rock. Are you really going to burn a card from your hand to bring that one player back to the same turn as everybody else? I mean, you can. Unlike ritual cards, which provide a burst of mana that ultimately expire at the end of the turn, Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are going to be sticking around and continuing to provide more and more mana with each passing turn. Whether or not cutting your opponent off those resources is the right play is very much a judgment call you kind of need to make for yourself, but obviously since it's here on the list, it's generally not the call people make. Anecdotally, I've played a lot of Commander, and could count on one hand the number of games where someone's Soul Ring actually gets taken out by spot removal. Generally speaking, if these cards are being outed, it's by a full board sweeper like Vandal Blast or Bane of Progress. A big reason these absurd cards get left alone is because most Commander decks are playing healthy amounts of ramp on their own, and while you may not open your own Soul Ring, there are plenty of cards that can help close the gap on the following turn. It's generally not worth it to handle the ring if you can just instead use your turn to simply gain more resources of your own, and that way help further your own game plan. Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are undeniably broken cards, but the way that early turns of Commander are often structured makes it highly unlikely they get dealt with, and obviously by the later turns, they're not going to have as high of an impact anyway. Up next at number 4 is Goblin Welder. For 1 red mana, you get a 1/1 Goblin Artificer. Its ability lets you tap it to target 2 artifacts controlled by the same player, one in their hand and one in their graveyard. That player then sacrifices the artifact from the board and brings back the artifact from their graveyard to the field. If you've ever played with or against Goblin Welder, you're likely already aware of just how powerful this card can be. While it can be an annoyance that shuffles around artifacts on the opponent's board, more often than not, it's going to be cycling cards for the controller, with combo pieces, threats, and stack cards all able to be oppressively used in various ways. Welder can be used in an insane range of powerful interactions, and in some playgroups is possibly an auto kill, but much like some of the other entries we've talked about, can also seem pretty innocuous. It's a card that can look pretty innocent since you have access to your opponent's graveyard and have a general idea of the things that they can do with it. However, since Goblin Welder happens to also be instant speed, it means that if your opponent was ever to discard a genuine threat, they now have access to it, and outing the Welder isn't going to solve the issue anymore. Granted, there are still ways to play around Welder. Targeted removal actually does work pretty well here, as does Graveyard Hate, since removing either half of the targeted artifacts will result in the effect fizzling. But if you choose to go that route, the Welder sticks around and can use the effect again on the next turn. So if you choose not to out the Welder and to respond to the targets instead, now you potentially have to spend 2 cards to keep it from being a problem by stopping the initial activation of its effect before deciding that you were ready to handle the little guy. It's another example of a card that doesn't present a problem until suddenly it does, and by the time it does, it's already too late. So the choice is yours. Are you going to spend that Swords to Plowshare on the 1/1 without any relevant target showing? Or are there simply bigger fish to fry? Starting off the top 3 is Visera Seer. For 1 black mana, you get a 1/1 Vampire Wizard. Its effect is short and sweet. Sacrifice a creature in order to scry 1. You already know exactly why this card is here, and likely a dozen other cards that could share a spot with it. It's time, friends. Let's talk about sacrifice outlets. The very second one of these cards hits the field, the entire table is already on high alert. You may not know exactly what combo is coming, but you know with certainty that one is. Should be an easy decision. It's obviously a combo piece, so get rid of it. Except that you can't, at least not in any meaningful way. The number of infinite loops that can be performed with the use of a free sack outlet are just too numerous to count. The vast majority of creatures with these kinds of effects can use them at instant speed and have the option of sacrificing themselves on a whim. So removal options that could potentially permanently remove the issue, cards like Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, or Anguished Unmaking, will never be able to connect properly. And since sacrificing things at instant speed is how most of the combos work anyway, it also means that you can't properly respond to the other pieces they bring out either. But hey, at least if you force them to sack the outlet, it's off the board, right? Until you stop to consider that almost all of them are in black, the color filled to bursting with reanimation. Especially in the command zone, with common commanders like Carador and Marin having easy and repeatable ways of bringing the outlets back over and over again. There's really only one way to properly out a sack outlet, and that's graveyard removal. But if you're following along, you've probably realized that you have to actually get the problem card into the graveyard first. So if you want to get rid of Visera Seer, you have to first force it off the field, then exile it from the graveyard. Then hope they don't have a carrion feeder waiting in the wings to force you to do it all over again. Once a sacrifice outlet comes into play, it's pretty common for the table to immediately start discussing how to handle it. But the reality of the situation is that truly getting rid of these cards is extremely difficult. Flourishing into the number 2 spot, we have Gaias Cradle. Cradle is a definitely affordable legendary land that taps to make a green mana for each creature you have in play. So if you have an empty board, this card is literally a worse basic forest. That's the sound of me when I lie. Gaias Cradle is easily one of, if not the most powerful lands in the game. To be honest, this spot can easily be shared by any number of other lands that bring the capacity to produce absurd amounts of mana, things like Cabal Coffers or Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. While spot removing mana rocks may not be a super common play, very few players would argue the merit of removing these absolutely broken resource generators. So why don't they get outed more often? Because they simply belong to the most difficult card type to interact with. Full stop. Destroying lands is very much a frowned upon practice in Commander. It directly removes the ability of a player to play the game, and as a result, land destruction, even in a limited capacity, isn't often found in non-competitive games. Here's the problem with that mindset though, and I'll consider this a PSA for playgroups who have gotten steamrolled by these lands before. Playing some 1-for-1 land destruction is how you keep these kinds of cards honest. Now sure, there are cards that can target any permanent, things like Beast Within and Generous Gift come to mind, but by utilizing 1-for-1 land destruction lands, you can keep those cards up for other meaningful threats on the field, and handle the issue at the cost of a single land drop. Of all the entries on this list, I honestly think this is the one where these cards could easily be outed more often, but people either don't want to or are unwilling to play methods to do so. If you really don't want to play full-on land removal, at least try to find a spot for Ghost Quarter, which replaces the land you got rid of. If someone gets upset that you blew up their Turboland, don't feel too bad. Just imagine what they would have done if you hadn't. And topping the list at number 1 is Ristic Study. If you were asked to think of the most iconic card for the Commander format, you'd probably say Sol Ring. But if you were asked the second most iconic card, you'd probably say Command Tower. Okay, but look, Ristic Study is still one of the pillars of the Commander format. For 2 and a blue, you get an enchantment with one very well-known effect. Anytime an opponent plays a spell, you speak 4 words. Are you paying 1? If they say no, you get to draw a card. Ristic Study is an extremely old card that still feels like it was custom made for Commander. In a game where you have 3 opponents all casting spells, Ristic Study is an absolutely incredible draw engine, especially in the first few turns of the game, when players are going to be setting up their resources and mana curves are going to be tight. In a worst case scenario, Ristic Study makes all of your opponent's spells cost an extra mana, and in a best case scenario, you get to draw more cards than you know what to do with. Sitting behind it, it's so obvious how insane this card is, but when you sit across from it, what are your choices? I mean, how much does that extra 1 mana really matter to you? If you let them draw a single card, is it really that big of a deal? Honestly, Ristic Study is one of these cards that does so much and so little at the same time. It impacts everything your opponents do without actually impacting them. We've been talking a lot about assessing threats. When you're deciding what to spend your removal on, one of the biggest factors to take into consideration is how the card is likely to affect you, both during that current turn and on future turns. If you're perfectly fine spending the 1, why would you bother removing it? Maybe because someone else at the table decides not to pay. Maybe they can't for some reason. It's easy to overlook Ristic as not being a problem for you, so it's not worth spending a card on, but unfortunately, the decision to let the opponent draw cards isn't only up to you. This makes Ristic one of the most political and honestly meme-worthy cards in the entire format. While removing Ristic is definitely not a bad play in most cases, very, very rarely are people going to take the time to remove a card with minimal impact on their own personal play patterns. In my opinion, this card is a no-brainer for the number 1 spot, being one of the most commonly played and most powerful cards in the format that manages to do just little enough to avoid getting removed from the board. And that's going to do it for today's top 10. In a format as unique and diverse as Commander, obviously everyone's experiences are going to differ, but this collection of cards, in my experience, exists in a weird limbo of being crazy good, but just not being outed nearly as often as they should be. Are there other cards that you think fit that mold? Leave them down in the comments below, and remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my next upload. With that, I am an avid herpetologist. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.